Everybody remember?
Yeah.
Oh, is it recording?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. All right. We have a microphone tonight. Sharon asked because she's going to be wearing a mask. And those of us that know that COVID is back and haunting our doorsteps. I'm going to get my shot this week. So welcome. We're really glad that you folks showed up here for this talk, partly because it's really going to be fun to learn about these bees. My name is Elliot DeBill. I'm the president of Friends of the Arcata Marsh, and we're the sponsoring organization for this series of lectures. Next month, the talk will be by Janelle Wynowski. I was afraid I was going to blow that, but I got it. Janelle is going to talk about birds, the plovers and ravens. So everybody loves birds and bees. There's a theme there. So come back next month for that. There are 2 bathrooms in the back to do the housekeeping things, and there's a water fountain right around the corner. Feel free to jump up at any time and utilize those. Tonight's talk is discovering native bees, and I'm interested in learning why it's an accidental journey. Our speaker tonight is Sharon Levy, and she's been here a long time. I've been volunteering here before dirt was invented. And I remember bumping into Sharon as we dug up Spartina densiflora. And you know, the roots of that sucker wrap around rocks. And so it's almost like you have to baby every single plant out of the ground if you're going to do it by hand in a rocky area. So Sharon and I did that. Another thing to point out is that Sharon is a science writer. And one of her great efforts is this Marsh Builders, the history and some science on how the Arcata Marsh was built, what its purpose is, some of the adventures that had to happen along the way. And she's thinking about an update to it. So what do you think? Another year or 2? At least. It takes a while. Yeah. So for tonight, let's enjoy learning about an accidental journey to native bees. Sharon Levy.
Thanks, Elliot. Can you all hear me? Okay, so the first thing I want to tell you is that I am not a bee expert, but I have been for around 20 years turning into a bee geek. I really like bees. I've been observing them more and more. And this past year, I got a macro lens for my camera and started photographing them. I started volunteering for the California Bumble Bee Atlas, which we'll talk about more later. But yeah, disclaimer, I am not a bee expert. So, what I was for most of my career was a science journalist. And in 2005, my editor at Honoris Magazine called me and asked me to report on a sudden decline in the population of domesticated bees. And I said, sure. I mean, I was the only person associated with the magazine who was anywhere in California. And I went to the Sierra foothills to meet up with this guy who's holding up his frame of beehive. His name was Jeff Anderson. And he's a migratory beekeeper who moves cross country every year with hundreds of hives loaded on a truck. His home base is in Minnesota, where he grew up. And his spring will start in February in the almond groves of California, which are the very earliest blooming crop. And then he'll take his bees to some early blooming fruit crops.
I'm sorry.
What?
we can't see your pictures on Zoom. So I'm gonna diagnose.
Okay.
Sharon is gonna dance.
Elliot? Elliot,
Yeah?
I believe you just have to start share screen on your computer.
Oh, so I knew it. It was my fault.
No, I think that's it.
Do I have that?
What is it?
Oh, look at there.
And then on the bottom, there should be share screen, right?
More. Share screen.
There, up one, there you go.
And there it is.
Perfect.
Thank you, Mark.
Perfect.
Okay, so I'm gonna hit play again and we're back running. Okay.
Okay. Where was I? I was telling you about Jeff Anderson and his migratory life as a beekeeper. And when I went to report on this story, I had no idea this was a thing. But it is very much a thing. And Jeff was hardly unique. There are thousands of honeybee hives that are trucked thousands of miles across the US every year to pollinate crops. And this is going on because modern agriculture and modern cities have pretty much destroyed the great majority of habitat for native bees. And so the crops are reliant on these domesticated honeybees. And it's a pretty complicated, expensive endeavor. So California's almond orchards are early bloomers. And if you look at this photo, it's really pretty. The almond trees are in bloom, and you can see some honeybee hive boxes sitting there. And for perhaps 3 weeks or a month, there will be a lot for the bees to do here in this orchard. And then the bloom will be over. And because the farmers, like most big farmers, keep the area absolutely free of anything seen as a weed, which would include all the native flowering plants, this is a desert for bees for most of the year. Okay, I'm going to be talking about pollination a lot, so I felt like I should give a basic review of what pollination is. It's how bees eat and how plants have sex. So I do have a little pointer here. So flowering plants, they have male sex organs called anthers that produce pollen grains. And pollen is the plant equivalent of sperm. It's also a very high protein food for bees. And when, let's say this is a bumblebee, when the bumblebee goes and visits the flower, she'll pack the pollen onto these little carrying spaces on her back legs. But in the process of doing that, she'll get pollen all over herself. And when she goes to the next blossom, there's a high chance that she'll get some pollen on the female organ, which is the stigma. And then the pollen can get down to the ovary and fertilize a seed and allow the plant to set fruit. So this is important stuff. So one thing you need to know about honeybee hives is they can have thousands of worker bees in them, which are all female. The worker bees collect pollen and nectar for food, and they build the honeycomb, and they take care of the larvae and basically do every bit of work. The queen stays in the hive laying eggs, and the males, you'll see a few of them trundling around if you look into a beehive, but their only function is to eventually mate with the queen. What's that?
Other queens.
With other queens?
Yeah, not the queens.
Right, not their mom, but other queens. So in the spring of 2005, when I was working on this research, many migratory beekeepers had found that their colonies suffered heavy losses over the winter. And across the US, about 1/3 of commercial honeybee colonies had died out. The result was a pollinator panic in the almond orchards of Central California. Fees for renting beehives went up from $48 to as much as $140 per colony. And beekeepers began to travel to California from as far away as Florida and North Carolina because the pay was so good. But it was an unusual situation. So pollination is essential to life as we know it. Just going to run some statistics by you. More than 85% of the world's flowering plants rely on pollinators, which can include moths and birds and other critters, but it's often bees. And this includes more than 2/3 of the world's crops. United States farmers grow more than 100 crops that need pollination. And agribusiness is addicted to domesticated honeybees, and at times has been running short of them. So a few months after my article was published, researchers studying the honeybee decline named it. They called it colony collapse disorder. And the way you can tell it's colony collapse disorder is that the worker bees disappear and they leave the queen and the larvae in the hive to starve. The researchers saw multiple potential causes. The first concern was infection with mites called varroa mites and other parasites of bees, exposure to insecticides and other pesticides. And Jeff Anderson, the beekeeper I hung out with, told me in a lot of detail about watching his bees die after his neighbor in Minnesota sprayed insecticides on his field. Another potential cause was the stresses of cross-country travel, because so many beekeepers are on the road with their bees all spring and summer. And the other issue is loss of habitat. Pardon me, I'm turning a page. So, can you all hear me without the microphone?
Yeah.
Oh, happy day. Okay. Oh, is it?
Yeah.
I can leave it there. Okay. Honeybees don't belong here in North America. They were brought here by European settlers in the 1600s. And the motivation the settlers had was they wanted to harvest honey from domesticated bees. So while a lot of the press is about honeybees, they're introduced, and native bees can be really efficient pollinators, and they're also really diverse and fascinating and cool. So while I was researching that first bee article, we good?
Yes.
While I was researching that first bee article for On Earth, it came to my attention that honeybees are not native and that they're actually a form of livestock. And producing more honeybees to solve the pollination crisis would be kind of like breeding more cows to restore native herbivores. It doesn't quite make sense. So I went and talked to this fellow, Robin Thorpe, who was an entomologist at UC Davis. And he really turned me on to the very complicated world of native bees. There are more than 4,000 species in the US and Canada, and Robin Thorpe knew them in great detail He passed away in 2019, but he did a lot of amazing work before that. There we go. So I swiped this photo from, I can't remember his name, but he's with the US Geological Survey, and he does these amazing macro level photos of bees. And these are all indigenous bees. And I just wanted to give you an idea how colorful and diverse they can be. And they often don't look like what we think a bee looks like. It can be iridescent green or iridescent blue. The honeybees are furry and colorful. Pardon me, the bumblebees are furry and colorful. And they're fascinating critters. So I'm going to talk some about bumblebees and then the rest of the native bees. There are about 46 species of bumblebees that are native to the US and Canada. And some people count it as a few more species because of taxonomic arguments between splitters and lumpers that I don't want to get into. But bumblebees live in colonies that survive for a single season. And the queens that are around at the end of the summer will overwinter underground and emerge in the spring and found a whole new colony. But everyone aside from those hibernating queens dies off and is gone over the winter. So this is a photo of a honeybee colony, a bumblebee colony, pardon me. And you can see it's sort of reminiscent of a honeybee colony, but it's not nearly as structured and organized. And the darker brown cups that are kind of wide open are nectar storage, and the round things that are closed have larvae inside them. So the vast majority, should I worry about that thing being over the top of the slide, Elliot, or?
I can get rid of it.
Oh, go for it.
That'd be great. Well, I don't call it taking over. So you go to more, and then you go hide something. Hide floating meeting controls, maybe? Yeah, and then it would also maybe be good to get this minimized because we don't really need to see her. This thing is really obnoxious. Okay, well, anyway, I don't know how to get rid of the lead meeting.
Yeah. Maybe move it up so it's.
If we click OK, it'll probably go away. This.
Okay. So I mentioned before there are about 4,000 native bee species in the US and Canada, and only maybe 46 to 49 are bumblebees. So that leaves lots and lots and lots of solitary bees. And these bees are super cool and interesting, but lots of people are just unaware of them. So what it means that a bee species is solitary is that each female, when she emerges in the spring, she goes about building her own nest, and she lays eggs, and she collects pollen and nectar and leaves food behind in each little chamber where she places an egg, so that when the larvae hatches, she'll have food to feed it. They'll have food to eat, and then she dies before her babies are born, often. So in this slide on the left, there's a digger bee digging her nest hole. And I came across this photo on the right. They're solitary bees, but sometimes they do nest in aggregations. So Each female is doing her own little nest hole, but sometimes they'll do them all in a big clump together. And I've seen nothing this extensive, but the silver bees that we have in the dunes here at Landfair and Moel and those kinds of places will nest in little aggregations. You'll see bunches of their holes all in one place. Okay. So as I mentioned before, most farm fields are kept free of quote unquote weeds, which include native plants. And so they're empty of blooming flowers most of the year. They may look kind of green and lush, but there's nothing there for bees most of the time. And many native bee species are in decline. And somewhat like with colony collapse disorder, the causes are not entirely clear, but there are definitely more than one cause. So much of their habitat has been lost to urbanization and industrial agriculture, and commonly used insecticides are an ongoing threat. And these days, the big insecticide threat is neonicotinoid insecticides, which only came into use maybe 10, 15 years ago. But there's research from Claire Crennan, who's a PhD at Berkeley, and she has shown that even narrow hedgerows of native habitat can support enough native bees to service crops without bringing domesticated honeybees in. And the hedgerow idea, this is a picture from somewhere in Europe. Hedgerow idea is used more in Europe, and it's slowly being adopted by organic farmers here in the US. At the big industrial farms, I have not heard of them catching on yet. Okay, so to move on from honeybees, bumblebees can do something very important that honeybees cannot do, and it's called buzz pollination. It's needed to pollinate tomatoes, potatoes, eggplant, blueberries, and also some wild species like manzanita. And what goes on in buzz pollination is that these plants, many plants have flowers where the anthers keep the pollen on the outside so that any pollinator who bumbles by will pick up some pollen. But these plants somehow co-evolved with buzz pollinators, and they have these long skinny anthers, and the pollen is locked up inside. And there's one little hole at the end where the pollen can come out. The bee's end of the business is, okay, standard bee anatomy. There's 3 sections to the body: the head, the thorax, and the abdomen, the hind end. And inside the thorax, there are 2 powerful sets of muscles that power the wings when the bee is in flight. But to do buzz pollination, the bee has a way to unhook her wings from the muscles. And instead, she uses those muscles inside her thorax to just make a really strong vibration. And while she's doing this, she's gripping this cone of anthers with her legs, and she's holding onto it. She'll bite into it with her jaw, and she'll wrap her hind end around it and just vibrate. And poof, all the pollen comes shooting out on the bumblebee.
So they have wings, it's just not attached to the muscles.
They just unhook them from their muscles. It's very cool. So for a long time, people who were growing crops like tomatoes, especially often tomatoes are grown in greenhouses, and so there's not, there aren't wild bees in there. And in order to pollinate the tomatoes, they had mechanical vibrators. They'd have to go through the whole greenhouse buzzing every flower to get the pollen to release. Until in 1985, a Belgian guy named Roland de Jong figured out that bumblebees can pollinate greenhouse tomatoes much better and with less labor than a person going around with a mechanical vibrator. So De Jong started a company that he called BioBest, and the company figured out how to take a queen bumblebee and raise a whole colony and sell the colony for people to use in their greenhouses. And other folks did the same thing. There were a couple companies in the Netherlands that have lasted long term. So they sell tomato growers these boxes of bumblebee colonies, and then bumblebees fly around and do all the pollination. So at some point in the early 90s, someone in the Western US was thinking they were going to do this with the Western bumblebee, which is native to the Western United States and was still common at the time. And because rearing a whole colony of bumblebees from one queen is a fairly complicated procedure, they wanted to get a leg up by having the people at BioBest who had experience rear some bees for them. So they shipped some queens of the Western bumblebee to the BioBest facility in Belgium. And this happened in the early 90s. And the Western bee offspring that were raised in Belgium were raised in facilities that also had European bees infected with a parasite called Nosema bombi. It's a fungal parasite that infects the gut of the bees. So the Western bees eventually were shipped back from Belgium. Worker bees were shipped back from Belgium in the mid-1990s and were used to pollinate tomatoes here in the US. And it seems very likely that the bees shipped from Belgium spread this Nosema infection to Western bees in the wild. And this can easily happen if the bees are outdoors, but it can also happen if the bees are in greenhouses, because they'll find any little crack and get out and look for more flowers outside. So Robin Thorpe had been tracking bumblebees throughout Central and Northern California for many years. And he documented a drastic decline in populations of the Western bumblebee and its close relative, Franklin's bumblebee, starting in 1998. Franklin's had, well, has, if it's still around, some people think it's extinct. It had a very small range in Southern Oregon and Northern California, and I don't think anyone has seen one in quite a while. The Western bumblebee lives throughout the Western US, and they're still being found in places like Arizona, but they're much less common than they used to be. And no one's found them in California for a long time. So the timing of these declines seem to fit with the arrival of the bees from Europe. And Robin Thorpe really believed that this was what was driving the declines. So he and some other researchers did a study where they looked at the level of Nosema infection in US bumblebees over time. And the little round bubbles, the size of the little bubbles gets bigger with the proportion of bees that are infected. And if you look at the timeline, these are all native US bee species. Occidentalis is the Western bee. And you can see these three species, the level of infection starts going way up in the later 1990s. And these populations all began to disappear in the later 1990s. Bombus terricola is also native. It's an eastern bee, and it was not very much affected, which is great. So it may be possible that some species have more resistance than others.
Can they move west?
Uh, who knows? I mean, they've been where they've been a long time. Yeah. So Thorpe really believed that imported parasites, there were some aside from Nosema, but he thought Nosema was the main thing, were driving these bee declines. And he kept searching for Western and Franklin's bees for years after his retirement. And in 2010, he petitioned the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to list Franklin's bee under the Endangered Species Act. But the picture is not that simple. It's true that commercially raised bees tend to have higher rates of Nosema infection, but the fungus Nosema bombi did exist in North American bees before the commercially raised bees from Europe got here. And researchers have not been able to find a genetic marker that will distinguish the North American and European strains of Nosema bombi. So one thing that's possible and that some researchers have looked at is that exposure to insecticides may increase the bee's vulnerability to Nosema infection. So what this graphic is trying to show is just that, so this little doodad is a symbol of Nosema. And if a Nosema infected bee visits a flower, it can leave the fungus behind in that flower, and other bees that come and go can pick it up. The other thing that can happen is that if an infected adult goes back to the colony carrying the infection, they'll infect the larvae. And this is bad news. It affects the ability of the larvae to mount an immune response. Less direct effects are that if the adults are in poor health, they just won't be able to feed the larvae as well, which can lead to the larvae having an impaired immune response. And the other thing is that since this fungus, the Nosema fungus, lives in the bee's gut, it can mess up the microbiome in the gut and cause lowered immune responses that way. So there's all kinds of ways things can get awry. So I mentioned neonicotinoids before. I'm going to say neonic because I hate saying neonicotinoid. Neonics became available in the mid-1990s, and so widespread use of neonics fits that timeline of these native bee declines too. So it seems quite likely that neonics are involved. And neonics are synthetic chemicals that are created to be similar to nicotine, which is a natural poison, and it affects the nervous system of insects. The advantage of neonics is it's much less toxic to mammals and birds than some of the older guard pesticides that are now going out of use were, and that's great. But neonics are very toxic to insects of all kinds, including bees and other pollinators. Neonics are often used to treat seeds. So these are some soybean seeds. The blue ones were treated. Some corn, the red ones were treated. And the neonics go systemic. So what that means is the plant, however it's applied, it can be sprayed or put on as a dust or put in irrigation water. It can be applied a lot of ways. But when the neonic gets into the plant incorporates that into its tissues. And so it stays there in the plant a long time. And that also means that pollen and nectar can be contaminated with neonic and affect the pollinators. There are still many unanswered questions on the causes of native bee declines. And a couple of years ago, the Xerces Society, which does a lot of work on invertebrate conservation, started Bumblebee Atlas projects. I believe there are Atlas projects going on in 20 different states to enlist the help of citizen scientists in gathering data on bee populations. And this is a little black-tailed bee that I took a picture of here at the marsh. And the reason that they're focusing on bumblebees instead of all those very diverse solitary bees is that bumblebees are big and colorful and easy to see. And a lot of the solitary bees are tiny, and just, it would be a lot harder for amateurs to track them. So I started volunteering for the California Bumble Bee Atlas this past summer. And I'm just going to show you some of the bees I encountered. So the most common species is the yellow-faced bee, Bombus vosnesensky. And the picture on the left is of a vosnesensky having a little orgy in a California poppy. They were really fun to watch. They kind of get in there next to the anthers and just wiggle all around. And they seem pretty blissed out. The picture on the right here is a vosnesensky that I was in the middle of processing according to the survey protocol. So the first thing I want to tell you about Bumblebee Atlas surveys is that no bees are harmed. They're all released, happy and alive at the end of the survey. And what you do is you have a net and you go out where there's some good habitat and good foraging flowers, and you look for bees. When you see a bee, you get it in your net, and then you pop it into, I use some centrifuge tubes that are about yay long. You pop the bee in the centrifuge tube, put the lid on it, and then put the tube in a cooler with some ice. And if the bee is cold for about 45 minutes or so, she will kind of curl up and go still. And then you can put her on some graph paper like that and take close-up photos so that the pros at Xerces can confirm your ID and correct it if it's wrong, and see what condition the bee is in and all that kind of stuff. And then you put them out in the sun and watch them fluff up and fly away, which I think is the most fun part of the whole thing. I'd say the second most common species I saw was the black-tailed bee, Bombus melanopygus. So this one is on some big leaf lupin that was right off of I Street. If you're a Marsh person, you probably know where that was. And this one is on some California poppy that was on I Street a little farther along. I'm very fond of these guys. They tend to go around with their little tongue stuck out, and which makes them look kind of snooty. I enjoy that. I've seen them on lots and lots of different plants. The first I saw them really early in the spring was on some ceanothus at the Humboldt Botanical Garden. They love that ceanothus. Okay. The third most common bee was this fella, Bombus californicus, which in the survey is called Bombus fervidus. I'm not sure what's going on there. I'm certainly not going to argue with any bee taxonomists, but it looks somewhat similar to a vosnesensky, but the face is black. There's no yellow hair on the face. And this one is on a clover here at the marsh. The rarer species, this one is Bombus mixtus, and it's kind of on a smaller scale like a melanopygus. But I was able to ID them by this nice reddish patch of fur on the very end of their butt. And they were kind of exciting because I've been finding the same couple of species over and over, and it was like, aha, something different. So I believe I first found these. There was a big bloom of lupin in early summer on Mount Trashmore. And that was quite a survey. That was like every time I turned around, there was another bee. And I couldn't really keep up with it. It was a survey where at the end of it, I had to kind of lay down. And the rarest species I got in the survey was this one, Bombus caliginosus. The common name is the obscure bee. I have no idea why. Got a tiny bit of yellow hair on the face, but it doesn't really look like a Vosnesensky, and it's got yellow and black stripes on the abdomen. And the only one of these I caught was up on Horse Mountain. The survey protocol is to do at least 2 visits to each of your sites, and I wanted to go back to Horse Mountain, but I had pneumonia instead, so only 1 Horse Mountain visit this summer. And one thing I noticed that was very obvious is that native bees like native plants. And if you just walk around the marsh in spring or summer, you'll see that the native bees are on native plants. They will occasionally go on an introduced plant, but you kind of have to wait a long time. This is a photo of that big riverbank lupin bloom that was on Mount Trashmore. They loved it. There were at least 4 species there, and they were all over. This other flower is a wild onion that was growing on this like stark gravel slope on Horse Mountain. And it was insane with bees. I'd never seen anything like it. So every time I swiped my net to get a bumblebee, I would get a honeybee in there by mistake. And I had to develop a new technique to release the honeybee while keeping the bumblebee for the survey. There's definitely a learning curve on doing these surveys. I did my very first survey at Malel Dunes, and I was a little nervous about maybe getting stung, which hasn't happened yet, by the way. But I was walking around some native dune mat habitat at Malel, and I saw these bees that looked like bumblebees to me. They were kind of furry. They had their pollen packed on their hind legs like a bumblebee. And I collected 7 of these guys. And when I took the photos, I photographed them in the field, and then I go look at the photos after I get home. And I realized they weren't bumblebees at all. This is a solitary bee, the Pacific dune digger or silver bee, that only lives in the dunes. And I got all geeked out on them. And I was fortunate to connect with Kim McFarland, who is a real expert on silver bees. And she just knows the Lanfear Dunes ecosystem in such detail, and what all the insects are doing in such detail. If you ever get a chance to go out there with her, it's great. So the silver bees only live in dunes, and they emerge in springtime. And each female digs her own nest hole. So this is kind of neat because she's the same color as the sand, but this is a female silver bee digging her nest hole. And once she has a hole, she'll dig 4 or 5 tunnels leading off of it, and then she'll lay an egg in each hole and gather pollen and nectar and leave food for each larva that's going to hatch out. And this is on the right, this is a silver bee on a bloom of San Verbena with her little snoot out. When the females emerge, they're accosted by a big crowd of males. It's a known phenomenon called a mating ball, but I saw this happening out at South Malel, and I texted Kim because it was like a bee riot. I had no idea what was going on. And she explained, yes, that's a mating thing. The female comes out and she's just looking around, wondering what's up, and she kind of gets mobbed. And this is a photo of a bee mating ball that I found on the internet that was just a much better photo. And yeah, I'm just glad I'm not a bee. So another of the interesting solitary bees that live in the dunes is the wool carder bee. And these bees scrape the hair off the beach buckwheat, which has this nice furry leaf. And they use that hair to line their nests. I didn't get to actually see a wool carder bee. I did take this photo of the kind of the wool carder bee signature that it leaves when it's worked a leaf. But I stole that photo from someone who had better luck than me. So in early September, I got Kim to go back to Lanphier with me, and we were looking for this species, Megachile wheeleri. It's a leaf cutter bee. And it carries its pollen on the underside of the abdomen. So you can see here that the underside is all bright yellow, and that's pollen in the abdomen. Leafcutter bees come out in late summer because they rely on dune goldenrod, which is one of the latest blooming flowers in the dunes. And they collect the plant's pollen and nectar to put in a supply of food for their eggs. And they cut these distinctive round or oval pieces out of goldenrod leaf. And they use them to build a little protective tube that they put each of their eggs in. So if you see that kind of cutting on a leaf, you know who did it. And each female leaf cutter digs her own nest hole. So the picture on the left is a little leaf cutter bee nest hole. And while we were sitting there watching it, these very pretty kind of iridescent blue-green wasps were marching in and out. And Kim told me that those are parasitic wasps that lay their eggs in the leafcutter bee hole so that their offspring can eat the leafcutter bee larvae. So it's a tough world out there. The other thing that we saw lots of these big holes, and they were right near the base of a goldenrod plant. And so Kim says those are skunks digging up the nest to eat all the larvae. And there were lots of those big holes. I think we need some skunk predators out there at the dunes. So all of this is really just scratching the surface. I get a little more geeky every couple of months, but this is most of what I know right now. If you're interested in ways to help, you can drop your mic. If you're interested in ways to help native bees, you can grow native flowering plants in your garden, and even just a little bit, flower pot or two can be a significant resource. You can avoid using pesticides. If you're interested, you can photograph bees that you see and submit sightings to Bumble Bee Watch, which is online. Or you can volunteer for the California Bumble Bee Atlas, which is also online. And that's most of what I got. I'd be happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
iNaturalist?
Sure, you can submit your bee sightings to iNaturalist. And that's a good thing to do if you see solitary bees, because Bumblebee Watch and Bumblebee Atlas are not going to be interested. So, yeah.
I had a question about the Xerxes Society.
Yeah.
The last time I heard about Xerxes, he was the emperor of the Persian Empire, 500 BC. So what does the name mean for
I have no idea. I don't know why they chose that name. Maybe it's the Latin name of some invertebrate. I mean, they also do like conservation of freshwater mussels, and they work with all kinds of invertebrates. So, yeah, I don't know. Yes,
Are there non-native bumblebees? And you kept referring to, I know the European bees and so forth, but the bumblebees and the other kind of wild solitary bees, are they all from here?
the great majority are native. The great, oh, the great majority of bumblebees and solitary bees that you will see are native. I think I've heard of one solitary bee species that's introduced, and I can't remember its name.
There's the alfalfa bee that was introduced from Europe.
Okay, and I know there are a few solitary bees that are kind of commercialized and used for agriculture. And I think alfalfa bees are one of them. There's also a bee called the alkali bee that is really good at pollinating alfalfa hay. And there's the osmia, the blue orchard mason bee is used in orchards, and so people are raising it.
That's a native.
That's a native, yeah. Yes.
So if you were going to get a native plant to put in a flower pot on your porch, what would you get?
Well, I've been thinking about this a lot because I realized that my own backyard is totally, it's a bee desert. And I've been thinking about it. I mean, in the past, I've had ceanothus in my yard. Ceanothus. Bees love ceanothus. One thing to do is to just go out to the native plant garden here and look around. I've seen a lot of bees on the Phacelia that was in the native garden. So yeah, I'm just starting to learn that because I want to have a bit of a pollinator garden. Yes, sir.
One thing that doesn't do, I think California has 2,000 native bees, is planting using one plant like ceanothus. It blooms at one particular time of the year, and that's it. So to think about a garden, what you can use actually from early spring until fall. There's
Yeah.
a whole bunch of different plants, but just planting something without really scratching your head may not do a whole lot.
Right, that's a good point. And there's a book, I can't remember the title now. Robin Thorpe was one of the co-authors, but it talks about bee-friendly plants for California gardens, and it talks about finding plants that bloom early, middle, late in the season, which is important.
Can someone give us a simple sequence? Like I have monkey flowers and blue-eyed grass and ceanothus. Will that spread it out?
It will. The first things that bloom that are important to bumblebees, particularly in hummingbirds, is Arcata manzanita.
Oh, yeah.
And that starts before the new year in my garden. They start blooming. So these female bumblebees that are in the ground, on warm days, they come out and get nectar. And you know they are not coming out for good because they don't collect pollen. They just get some nectar and then they go back in their hole. And then from then on, something like ceanothus comes on, but manzanita is critical early in the season for both hummingbirds and for, unless you give your hummingbirds that pink Kool-Aid, which is a bad thing. So ceanothus, it's then all sorts of different things that come out in the middle of it. But also the end of the season right now is really important for butterflies and for certain bees that are out there now. And I guess one of them we were looking at today was a coyote brush. And yellow flower on the beach, there's much more species of that inland here, and that's always a good one because it's a really late bloomer, and also the aster is a really late bloomer.
Yeah.
If you hit those two, you really help because when summer comes, there's a lot of things blooming. If it isn't in your yard, it's somewhere in here. So if you get those two, it makes a big difference.
And is Connect, is that one of the manzanitas that?
It is, but it's a low growing one and I've never seen, I mean, I see bumblebees and bees use it, but not like a bush.
Oh, okay.
And if you live in this town, it's, you'll see cats laying right next to it. Just hummingbirds and things like that.
Oh,
Yeah.
the lady in the red shirt had a question.
Oh, just a goldenrod is
That's what.
it's a native goldenrod for the end of the season. That's a really good.
Yeah,
Okay.
And the Native Plant Society, they just think their plant sale. And they have on their website, or they have handouts if you go out to the nursery of, you know, what's appropriate to plant around here, just specifically for bees and for butterflies.
Perfect. I'm tearing out a lawn and just plant a whole bunch of native. Great.
yeah.
So how often are you out there? And will your information show up in their publications online?
Well, I submitted all my data and I did, I think, 3 surveys at Malel and 3 surveys at the Marsh. And 1 survey at Horse Mountain. And then I have a lot of what they call incidental observations, where it's not, the surveys are timed. You do 45 minutes of bee collecting, and then you go through and identify everyone, and you write down some data about the weather and the habitat. And then you submit all that online to Bumblebee Watch. And so of all the data I submitted, 1 little incidental sighting has been confirmed and everything else is pending. So, and they say that since the folks from Xerces are out in the field most of the summer, that most of the data won't get confirmed until the 1st of next year, because there's just loads of data for them to go over. What exactly I don't know if they're gonna publish it, but they started in 2022, so they've been doing this for a couple of years. And I don't know if they're gonna eventually have a book like the Humboldt County Bird Atlas made a book, you know.
Will you come back and talk to us when they publish and give us the bigger picture as well as your work?
If I'm alive.
Where's the local Xerces Society, is the closest one there?
Okay, yeah, I don't really know the answer to that. I know they're based in the Pacific Northwest. So I think a lot of their people are based in like Portland or Seattle. But I don't really know.
They were up here, was it 2 years ago? They gave a talk and gave a walk around here.
And they did another walk this summer. I was in Alaska, so I didn't go. But they do, during the season, the Atlas people will visit different parts of the state, and so that people who are volunteers can go out with a pro and learn. Like I said, there's definitely a learning curve to finding the bees and handling the bees and knowing what you've got when you've got it. So they do that all over the state. Yeah.
So you might have mentioned it, but how many of these bees do the buzz pollination? All of them? The ones that you said?
Bumblebees all do it, and then some solitary bees do it. And I don't profess to know how many.
But it's common?
It's fairly common, and it's an interesting evolutionary question, like what's the advantage of locking up your pollen in this little chamber? I actually I found a journal article on that, but I didn't read it yet. So I can't tell you what the theory is.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Roughly, how many species are there in the Milky Way?
Oh, I don't know.
Graduate student did one up on the hill, US Forest Service one, I don't know if you're familiar with that. But I think she came up with close to 250 species up there, and that would be different. Closer you get to the coast, the less insects you get. So we would have a lot less than that, but that's just one fairly small area.
That's interesting.
Dunes, there's over 40.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I've had way over 50 in my garden in Fieldbrook, but I have a native plant garden that's pretty well been 50 years in the making.
Wow.
Well, every answer causes a question. So why does the diversity decrease as you get closer to the ocean?
I think it's just warmth and plant material.
They
And
don't like the fog then?
yeah, a lot of things, in fact, commonly when these queens come out in the winter looking on a nice warm day, usually 2 or 3 days in a row, they'll be getting nectar, but then all of a sudden the clouds will come over, get really cold, and you'll see these queens on the ground. And if you don't pick them up and help them, the ants will take care of them. But I will get them up, feed them some dilute honey, put them in a container, and put them in that refrigerator until we get a sunny day. Because they don't, and then let them go, because they don't have a colony in the winter, they're just hibernating. But they do like to come out, and that's for sure what'll happen,
Yeah.
it gets cold and they get stuck.
I do occasionally see bumblebees just flying around the marsh in December or January. Are those queens that are just hopping out? Okay,
And, yeah, it's pretty sparse, except for manzanita, might be blooming out here, but yeah, they're very common because they got a lot of manzanita. And there is a native plant wildlife garden up at, Tailsport on the west side, and that's planted to a lot of manzanita, so you see, bumblebees really early in the season there.
oh, okay. It looked like it had kind of gone weedy this year, but,
I'm the only one that takes care of it.
okay.
And I'm 77 years old, so there's a good reason, but I'm hopefully someday someone will help.
I'll send my neighbor over to you.
Okay. And I'm giving a walk talk, the first Saturday of every month there. So that's this Saturday.
All right.
And right there by Healthport,
Right, yeah.
yeah,
It's right on the west side of Hellsport. It goes up that hill.
right.
1 o'clock.
What
1
time?
o'clock.
1 o'clock this Saturday?
Yeah.
Okay.
And if it's a sunny day, there'll be at least 2 species of butterflies that are very common there.
Even this time of year?
Oh, yeah. Remember the late flowering, I have a lot of aster in there,
Okay,
and the crescents, the field crescent uses aster, that particular aster to lay their eggs on, and they have at least 4 generations right there. And right now, the Myleta crescent, which lays its eggs on thistle, is pretty common, but it's got to be sunny for butterflies.
all right.
There's a yellow one I remember from your talk. What's the name?
Sulfur.
Sulfur.
They're here now, and this is usually the time they're common.
I saw some today.
Yeah.
Okay. Did we do it? Any more questions? Thank you so much. Great. It's always great to talk to insect whisperers.
Thank you very much. This was great.
Oh, you're welcome. Did I get my little thumb drive back?
You will.
Okay,
So let me,
Oh.
Yeah.
Just.